from Abuja.
It's all about the human struggle to raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. I'm Magnus Packle, and this is Magnus Packle GVA. I appreciate you being a part of our show. In view today, opening up Africa to Africa, we visit with Professor Patrick L.O. Lumumba and Dr. Amani Asfour on the side of a recent conference in Mombasa, Kenya, as they share their insights on how Africa can become stronger from increased integration and cooperation. But before that, in our quick view, the International Criminal Court was it set up just for the prosecution of African leaders? That's coming up. The International Criminal Court, ICC, was established in 2002 as an independent international organization with headquarters at The Hague in the Netherlands, and with the sole purpose of bringing to justice perpetrators of various crimes against humanity. Currently, 122 countries, including many African countries, are signatories to the ICC statute. Since its inception, the ICC has indicted about 30 people. However, all of them have been from African countries, notably the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Central African Republic, Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. Consequently, the ICC is being heavily criticized by many Africans and the African Union. This apparent resentment has followed the much publicized determination of the ICC to prosecute President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya and his Vice President, Mr. William Ruto. And this has followed a cloud that the ICC has long held over the head of Mr. Omar al-Bashir, President of Sudan, as he is being charged with crimes against humanity for his role in the humanitarian disaster in Darfur. Is the ICC more active in Africa because the judicial systems among African countries are too weak to bring justice to big and powerful African leaders? Now compare with South America, where Argentina and Chile were able to prosecute their leaders and bring about justice without the intervention of the ICC, as evidenced in the case with General Jorge Rafael Videla in Argentina and General Augusto Pinochet of Chile and his followers. Considering this, many have argued that maybe Africa and especially the AU should focus on promoting justice for the well-being of Africans rather than promoting impunity for African leaders. We will soon do a full discussion on ICC and Africa. Still in view, opening up Africa to Africa. But before that, in our hidden economics, the law of sand and poverty. Ever notice how in villages across the developing world, there is sand everywhere? Of course, sand is a natural part of the earth and a fundamental resource, but its overabundance can be a sign of poverty. As we know, the poverty of many rural areas of developing countries causes man and beast to coexist. And beasts typically can't live without sand and dirt. But sand in its raw and abundant form does not have much economic value. And that is why it is in so much abundance or even surplus. In a simple way of saying it, development is principally about processing and refining things. That is, transforming from a raw form and condition of modest usefulness in contribution to that of enhanced economic value. Potential is a word often associated with underdevelopment, while potency is a word associated with development. Sand has potential, not potency. After it is refined from being processed, it has value. If raw sand has value, poor villagers would not be poor. They would have a great resource. It is hardly possible to find a grain of sand in very well developed places and communities around the world. However, in very poor communities, sand appears to be everywhere, even in their beds. Indeed, it appears there is a law of sand and poverty. The more sand you see in a community, the poorer the community is. It seems that if you cannot subdue sand, sand will subdue you. A lesson to learn here. Do not allow desertification to catch up with you. It brings poverty with it. Anyone or community that desertification catches will be made poor. Its sand is overwhelming. Sand being everywhere is proof that poverty is abounding. Poverty is always and everywhere the result of the inability of man to acquire the empowerment needed to control the challenges of his environment. People everywhere should strive to acquire the tools to reduce their poverty. Every community should know its sand and poverty index. When you see it going down, your poverty is declining. And if it's rising, your poverty is increasing. Our hidden economics for you. Africa's average economic growth of over 5% over the last decade has been attracting a lot of global attention in recent times. However, this growth has not yet translated into a noticeably improved standard of living in most parts of Africa, and especially when compared to other emerging economies, such as in Asia, where their growth experience has been transformational. Another area of disappointment for Africa is its degree of economic integration. Apparently, a serious lack of infrastructure and skill sets has undermined Africa's attempt at regional economic cooperation, perversely closing country borders. This lack of openness among African countries has limited intra-trade to about 10% compared to the European Union's 70%, Asia's 52%, North America's 50%, and South America's 26%. Africa's low level of integration has also negatively impacted the continent's global competitiveness, reflected in Africa's world trade share of a mere 3%. Recently, at an Africa Governance Management and Leadership Convention in Mombasa, Kenya, I had the opportunity to sit at the banks of the Indian Ocean with its waves and winds in a discussion with Professor Patrick L.O. Lumumba of Kabarak University in Kenya and Dr. Amani Asfour, President of BPW in Egypt, on how Africa can open up more to Africa. Please join us in our discussion. Now, this was a wonderful conference we just had, and you did such a masterful job, I must say. But now, going forward, now we've talked about opening Africa to Africa. Going forward, what should we walk away from here with? Are we really making progress? Are we opening up Africa to Africa? How are we doing so far?
You know, there's two groups. There are the Afro-pessimists who think that nothing is happening, and the Afro-optimists. I belong to the latter group. I believe that we can already see movement in that direction. And as I speak to you now, the President of Nigeria, President Goodluck Jonathan, has just arrived in Nairobi with 100 businessmen. That in itself is a statement that Africans are beginning to recognize that going forward, intra-African trade will be the factor that will move us in the right direction. And it's not only in Nigeria. We see the regional blocks. We see what is happening in the East African community. The movement of persons, the elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers. We see that in SADC in Southern Africa, what is happening down there with Zimbabwe, with Angola, with Tanzania, with Malawi and Zambia. In ECOWAS, we are seeing that too. So, in a nutshell, one can begin to see that Africa is moving in the right direction. Of course, that is not to say that there are not a number of impediments which stand in the way of faster movement. These will be there, and I think what we should be doing going forward is to ask ourselves how we should remove those barriers. The question is, are we continuing with that trend where the African was a commodity, and once again African natural resources are also being taken away without value addition? The question of the legal regulations in different countries, what are we doing about it? And there is a sense in which all these things, if we begin to address them in a practical way, then Africa will begin to realize our potential.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Asfour, the situation in Egypt now, causes us to ask a couple of questions. Now, Egypt to me was always a place of great stability. We didn't have all of this crisis now that we're beginning to have. Now we have to report it. So if it is not looking so good, we have to say it's not looking so good. Is this a very temporary thing? Can Egypt rebound very quickly so that we can start to report good things? And how do you see that across Africa as a whole?
I'm glad you asked this because he did not report anything about Egypt. It was not the African media who reports. It's about the Western media. It's about the BBC, the Al Jazeera, the CNN. Not a single African reporter came to see what's happening on the ground. The issue on the ground is highlighted as a coup. It is not a coup. It's 33 million people.
The army did not take over.
No, the army did not take over. On the contrary, the first regime went down, Mubarak went down, people went out, and the army came side of the people. The army will never, the Egyptian army is part of the people. They will never shoot a single bullet.
Essentially, I guess Egypt was going through some sort of disrepair that you guys are not correcting. So this we're in a correction phase. Is basically what is happening.
We call it
so
it's the second wind of the revolution to correct the first revolution.
Absolutely.
Now, I am happy that you asked me this because the African media, if we are talking about African Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, the African media should be on the ground to report.
We've got to get the African media in there to report it, to spread it, to get the real African story. I want the real story in Africa about why the East African community seems to be doing so well in terms of economic integration. About 20% of total trade versus, say, 7% in ECOWAS and smaller numbers in the Central African area. So what is the lesson for Africa to learn from what's happening amongst the East African community?
I think there are certain fundamental anchors which are of a historical nature. If you look at what we traditionally refer to as East Africa, we have peoples across the border. If you look at the Maasai, to be found in Tanzania and Kenya, the Luos to be found in all the three countries, the Kikuyus and all this. So traditionally and culturally you have peoples across the colonial borders. And number two, the traditional East African countries were all colonized by the British, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And even on the eve of independence, President Nyerere of Tanzania said, let us delay our independence so that we come out as one country. So I think we started on a very firm footing with East African community, and in the early days, therefore, the free movement of people and the free movement of goods is something that preceded the creation of these nations. That I think is very important. Number two, the first three leaders, that is Jomo Kenyatta, Paulo Milton Obote, and Julius Kambarage Nyerere, were very clear that you needed to have a market that would embrace these three countries. You have a larger population, you have people who have lived together for a long time. And I think that what the West African countries should do with the anchor of Nigeria and Ghana is to recognize that a larger market, free movement of peoples, is critical. The problem that I see with West Africa, of course, is that you have this divide of the so-called Anglophone countries, which comprises Ghana and Nigeria, and you may say even Sierra Leone, and you have these French colonies. And this is something that we don't say often enough. But I think part of the African problem is low self-esteem. In an African's unguarded moment, if they were colonized by the French, their orientation is to Paris. If they were colonized by London, their orientation is to England. And my view is that the African intelligentsia must liberate himself or herself from this intellectual enslavement. And very lastly, the African narrative must be told from an African perspective. I'm beginning to see a number of writers, books such as The Rise of India and China in Africa. Winner Takes It All, The Presence of China in Africa. So, in a nutshell, one could say that Africa can learn one lesson from East African community. The realization that it is your neighbors who can come to your aid at the shortest notice, and you are better to be in good terms with them. That is what will guarantee your long-term survival.
Guaranteeing the long-term survival of Africa, especially for now, since you're president of the Business and Professional Women's Association, don't we need to bring in women and younger people? So when we talk about inclusive growth, does that not mean also making sure that we give capacity to African women so that they can also contribute? What do you see in that regard? Is there any real progress being made in that direction?
Let me wear my other hat, which is the president for the African Alliance for Women Empowerment and the chair of the Human Resource Science and Technology Cluster of the African Union.
Please wear.
Yes, because that's how we really see that in Africa we have all the resources of the world. The human resources with 1 billion people almost, the natural resources with almost all the natural resources, say it, minerals, arable land, gold, diamond, oil, and we have the cultural resources, which is also a very big asset that we have to build on them. So building on our resources and saying about opening Africa to Africa, we are the richest continent, but yet we are the poorest of them. Why? We don't manage our own resources. We don't use our African brains. Science and technology is a crucial and a must for any transformation of any economy and any development of any nation. So African continent with 54 countries have to realize that the export of raw material can never happen. We have to have end product. And this end product, I always say that the real empowerment, the triad of empowerment, is about 3 pillars. The first pillar is the people. We have to build the capacity of our people and our human resource, including women and youth. And they have to be proud that we are African. The first pillar is the policy and the procedure. What procedures are put in place? What legislation and policies among us, the 54 countries, which integrate our economy, our inter-African trade, which empower the women and youth on the ground, empower the people on the grassroots. We have to look for the social and economic justice. And the third pillar is the product. What products we have in Africa? If we want to promote our inter-African trade, we have a good product, a competitive product, a value-added product, packaging, branding, designing. Where is science and technology helping the small and medium enterprise? Our economy, more than 95% of African economy is depending on SMEs.
Absolutely.
So it's the backbone of the economy. The small and medium enterprise are our way for our African renaissance. And science and technology have to be in agriculture, in energy, infrastructure, everything. So that's really how we come together, open up for Africa by our linkages. We have to link the scientific research center with the needs on the ground, with the women in the agriculture.
Yes. Now, Prof, that's very well said, Doctor. Prof, to summarize all of this, and then also to talk about some inclusivity. So we talked a lot about inclusive growth. Any final comment?
My final comment, there's something that I say half in jest and half in seriously. There was a divine directive, go ye and multiply. Africa does that very well in terms of population increase. But go ye and subdue the earth. Africa doesn't do that very well. And my own view is that an organization and an assembly such as we have had simply floods out some of the key issues. And my view now is that we must harness our human resource. We must also harness our natural resources. We must deal with issues of infrastructure. We must deal both with the hardware and the software issues and communicate this, because there is a tendency that some of the meetings we have are annual jamborees. And the African on the ground, the African in Jigawa State in Nigeria is left unmoved and untouched. That the African in Sinai in Egypt is unmoved and untouched. And this is where the media comes in. How are we communicating these opportunities to the rest of Africa? Today we were told that in the last 1 year, only 5,000 people visited Chad. If you ask any African child in Freetown in Sierra Leone whether they know where N'Djamena is, they have no idea, but they know where Philadelphia is. So Africans must begin to engage in this conversation, and if we do that, in the next 5 years, we'll be in a position to really multiply the impact of all these good initiatives in the African continent for the benefit of the African people, so that Africa can continue to compete not as a horse to be ridden, but as a rider to direct its own agenda.
Very well said, sir. I want to thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Doctor,
Thank you,
thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. The process of opening up Africa to Africa for the purpose of growth and competitiveness appears to be underway in the spirit of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD. However, how strong are the winds of this NEPAD spirit? The poor economic integration of Africa can be traced to the colonial era, where the colonial masters had created infrastructure systems mainly with the aim of transporting goods and services out of Africa to Europe. Other causes of the lack of integration in Africa can be found in the limited institutionalized encouragement and development of the private sector in Africa. The private sector in Africa is primarily handcuffed by a lack of basic infrastructure, such as reliable transportation networks, stable power, sufficient skilled labor, and adequate security, not to mention high tariffs and bureaucratic bottlenecks. These constraining factors, on the other hand, tend to make it easier for African entrepreneurs to look outside Africa for trade, especially riding on the colonial plank already laid to push resources from Africa to Europe, and now also to North America and Asia. Fortunately, we are starting to see signs of hope. As mentioned in our discussion, President Goodluck Jonathan, one of the most powerful leaders in Africa, led a 100 businessman team to Kenya to reflect one of Africa's boldest practical attempts to pursue economic integration. As a country, Kenya itself has been quite successful with trade among the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa countries, COMESA, accounting for over 50% of its exports. Already, a number of African companies have proven that intra-African trade is possible and rewarding, dismissing the myth that Africans do not have dissimilar goods to trade amongst themselves. Many South African companies are doing extraordinarily well, as seen in the success of MTN, ShopRite, and DSTV. From Nigeria, Globacom and many banks, including GT Bank and UBA, are already very successful across West Africa. And the Dangote Group has become well known across the whole of Africa. With adequate research and assistance from African governments, smaller companies can emulate the achievements of bigger firms and also spin their trade across Africa. And this can mark the beginning of the breakthrough that Africa needs to achieve enhanced global competitiveness, self-reliance, and inclusive growth. I'm Magnus Pakol, and that's my view.